In 1877, a miner named Harris Franklin stood in Deadwood Gulch, a narrow canyon in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, holding a pan of gravel. He swirled it, watching the water wash away the lighter material. He tilted it toward the light. Nothing. He tried another pan. Nothing. Another. Nothing. The easy gold was gone. Just 1 year earlier, thousands of miners had crowded into this narrow gulch, pulling gold from the creek with nothing more than pans and shoves. Some men made $100 a day. Some made more. The gold was so plentiful you could pick nuggets out of the stream bed with your fingers. Now, nothing but gravel and disappointment. This is the story of what happened when the placer gold ran out in Deadwood. It's the story Hollywood never tells, the boom-to-bust cycle that defined nearly every mining camp in the American West. It's about the thousands of men who arrived with dreams and left with nothing, about the companies that moved in when the individuals moved out, and about a town that had to decide whether to die quietly or transform into something else entirely. Between 1876 and 1879, Deadwood went from frontier chaos to corporate consolidation. The independent miner gave way to the wage laborer. The shallow digging gave way to industrial operations that burrowed hundreds of feet underground. And the men who'd come seeking fortune found themselves working for wages that barely covered room and board. The Black Hills Gold Rush began in 1874 when Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills, territory that belonged to the Lakota Sioux by treaty. His geologists found gold. Custer reported it. And despite the treaty, despite the warnings, despite the fact that the land was legally Sioux territory, prospectors flooded in. By April 1876, Deadwood Gulch was home to thousands of people living in tents, shacks, and dugouts carved into the hillsides. Within months, the population swelled to an estimated 5,000, with some accounts claiming even more. The town consisted of a single muddy street running along the creek, lined with saloons, gambling houses, brothels, and a handful of supply stores charging outrageous prices. The placer gold, the loose gold particles mixed with gravel in the creek bed, was astonishingly rich. On exceptional claims, miners could produce $50 to $100 per day. Experienced placer miners working for wages earned $4 to $7 daily. An exceptional claim might yield several hundred. Men worked standing knee-deep in icy water, shoveling gravel into sluice boxes and watching the gold collect in the riffles. It was back-breaking work, but the rewards were immediate. At the end of each day, you could weigh your gold, pocket your earnings, and spend it that same night in the saloons. The money flowed as freely as the whiskey. But placer deposits are finite. They're the gold that erosion has already freed from the rock, scattered by ancient rivers and concentrated in present-day creek beds. Once you wash all the gold out of the gravel, there's no more. The only way to get more gold is to dig into the hard rock where it originated. And that requires capital, equipment, and expertise that individual miners didn't have. By late 1876, just months after the rush began, the richest placer claims were already showing signs of depletion. Miners who'd been pulling $50 a day in July were lucky to get $10 a day by November. By spring 1877, many claims weren't producing enough to cover a man's expenses. The miner who'd invested everything to get to Deadwood, paying for transportation, tools, supplies, suddenly found himself in a desperate position. He couldn't afford to keep mining at a loss, but he also couldn't afford to leave. He'd spent every dollar getting here. Going home meant admitting defeat with empty pockets, so thousands of men stayed, hoping the next pan would be better, hoping they'd overlooked a rich pocket, hoping for luck that never came. Contemporary accounts describe the shift. One observer noted that by 1878, you could walk down Main Street and see disappointed men standing idle, their hopes as depleted as their claims. The saloons that had been packed shoulder to shoulder just a year earlier now had empty tables. The gambling houses saw smaller stakes. The brothels had fewer customers. The entire economic ecosystem that had thrived on gold-rich miners began to collapse. Here's what the history books often skip. When placer gold runs out, there's still gold in the ground, lots of it, but it's locked inside solid rock, sometimes hundreds of feet underground. Extracting it requires drilling, blasting, crushing, and processing or through stamp mills, massive machines that pulverized rock so the gold could be separated chemically. An individual miner with a shovel and a pan couldn't do that. It required industrial-scale operations with significant capital investment. The companies moved in almost immediately. Mining corporations, often backed by investors from San Francisco, New York, or even London, began buying up claims, consolidating properties, and building the infrastructure needed for hard rock mining. The most significant was the Homestake Mine, located about 40 miles from Deadwood in Lead, South Dakota. 4 men, Moses and Fred Manuel, Hank Harney, and Alex Eng, had discovered the Homestake lode in 1876. They sold their claim to a group of investors led by George Hearst for $70,000. Hearst, a California mining magnate and father of newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst, recognized the potential immediately. The Homestake would become one of the largest and deepest gold mines in North America. It operated continuously from 1876 until 2001, over a century of production. It eventually reached a depth of 8,000 feet and produced more than 40 million ounces of gold, worth billions of dollars in modern currency. But here's the critical point. None of that wealth went to the independent miners who'd rushed to the Black Hills in 1876. It went to corporations and investors. The men who'd dreamed of striking it rich became wage laborers working underground for $3 a day. The transformation happened quickly. By 1878, most of the placer operations in Deadwood Gulch had been replaced by corporate mining ventures. Companies built stamp mills along the creek, huge wooden structures housing cast iron stamps that rose and fell, crushing ore with a deafening pounding that echoed through the valley 24 hours a day. The work was dangerous. Miners descended hundreds of feet on rickety ladders or in shaky cages lowered by cables. They worked in near total darkness, lit only by candles stuck to their hats with clay. They drilled holes by hand, packed them with dynamite, and blasted through solid rock. Cave-ins were common, so were accidents involving explosives, falling rock, and equipment failures. And the pay? In the late 1870s, $3 a day. Maybe $3.50 if you were skilled. That was barely enough to cover room and board in Deadwood, where prices remained inflated from the boom days. A meal cost 50 cents. A bed in a shared bunk room cost another 50 cents. Whiskey was 15 cents a shot. By the time you paid for necessities, there wasn't much left. This was the brutal reality of the post-boom West. The men who'd come seeking independence and wealth found themselves trapped in an industrial wage economy that left them little better off than factory workers in the East. Some miners left. They drifted to new strikes in Montana, Colorado, Arizona. Anywhere rumors of easy gold persisted, the pattern repeated itself across the West. Rush in when placer gold is discovered, work the easy deposits, watch the corporate operations take over, move on to the next strike. But many stayed in Deadwood because leaving required money they didn't have. They became the permanent working class of the mining industry, men who'd come west for freedom and ended up with the opposite. The town itself underwent a transformation. The rough tent city of 1876 gave way to more permanent structures. False front wooden buildings replaced canvas shelters. The muddy street was graded and improved. By 1879, Deadwood had a school, several churches, and even an opera house. But the character of the town had changed. The wild energy of the early days, the sense that anyone could strike it rich at any moment, was gone. In its place was a grim industrial town dominated by mining companies, with a working class that toiled underground for wages and a merchant class that catered to them. The population fluctuated wildly. Census records show approximately 3,800 people in Deadwood in 1880, down from the estimated peak of over 10,000 just a few years earlier. Many had moved on. Others had died. Some had given up and returned east. Even more telling, only 29% of those remaining listed their occupation as miner. The independent prospector era was over. Fire devastated the town repeatedly. In September 1879, a fire started in a bakery and spread rapidly through the wooden buildings. It destroyed over 300 structures and left thousands homeless. Miraculously, only one man died, John King, known as Casino Jack, who was deaf and didn't hear the alarm. The town rebuilt, but the new buildings were designed with fire in mind. Wider streets, brick construction were affordable, better firefighting equipment. The famous figures of Deadwood's early days were mostly gone by then. Wild Bill Hickok had been shot dead in August 1876, just months after arriving. Calamity Jane drifted in and out of town, working odd jobs and drinking heavily. Many of the colorful characters who defined the town's mythology had moved on or died, leaving behind a more mundane reality. What remained were the companies: the Homestake, the Father de Smet, the Golden Star, the Caledonia. These corporate operations extracted millions of dollars worth of gold from the Black Hills over the following decades, but the wealth concentrated at the top, in the hands of investors and executives who often lived far from Deadwood. Here's a detail that captures the shift. In 1876, a successful placer miner might carry his gold dust in a leather pouch, trading it directly for goods and services. Merchants kept scales on their counters to weigh out payment. By the late 1870s, many miners were paid in company scrip, vouchers redeemable at company stores. The direct connection between labor and reward had been severed. The miner no longer owned his product. He sold his labor by the hour and received a wage barely sufficient for survival. The psychological impact was profound. Men who'd come west to escape factory work in the east found themselves doing essentially the same thing, just underground instead of in a textile mill. The promise of the frontier, independence, self-determination, the chance to build something of your own, had proven to be an illusion for most. Some adapted. They married, settled down, bought property in town, and made lives as best they could. Deadwood had families, schools, social organizations. It wasn't all bleakness and disappointment. But for the men who'd come specifically for gold, who'd invested everything in the dream of striking it rich, the reality must have been crushing. There are stories of men who simply walked away from their claims and disappeared into the wilderness. Others drank themselves to death in the saloons that had once been monuments to prosperity. A few turned to crime, stagecoach robbery, claim jumping, theft, anything to recapture the promise of easy money. The Deadwood Cemetery tells part of the story. Mount Moriah Cemetery, established in 1877, filled rapidly with graves. Many were miners killed in accidents, some were victims of violence, others simply died of disease, exhaustion, or despair. The grave markers, when they existed at all, often listed no occupation, no hometown, no family, just a name and a date. Anonymous men who'd come seeking fortune and found only hard ground. Wild Bill Hickok's grave became a tourist attraction almost immediately. Visitors would come to see where the famous gunfighter was buried, paying little attention to the hundreds of ordinary miners interred nearby. Even in death, the mythology overshadowed the reality. By the 1880s, Deadwood had settled into a stable but unremarkable existence. It was a company town, dominated by mining operations, with an economy built on extraction rather than opportunity. The corporations that controlled the mines controlled everything else: housing, stores, even local politics. The environmental toll was severe. The stamp mills that crushed ore dumped mercury and arsenic-contaminated waste directly into Deadwood Creek. The water that had once yielded easy gold became poisonous. Trees were cut down for mine timbers and fuel, leaving the hillsides barren. The landscape itself was transformed, scarred by mine shafts, littered with waste rock, stripped of vegetation. This was the hidden cost of gold mining, rarely mentioned in the triumphant narratives of Western expansion. The wealth extracted from the Black Hills enriched distant investors while leaving behind a damaged landscape and a population of wage laborers with little prospect of advancement. Yet, Deadwood persisted. It had to. The corporate mines needed workers. The workers needed housing, food, and supplies. The merchants who'd invested in permanent buildings had nowhere else to go. So the town continued, diminished but functioning, a shadow of its brief moment of wild prosperity. Some technological improvements did benefit the workers. By the 1880s, better ventilation systems made underground work somewhat less lethal. Safety cages replaced rope and ladder shaft systems. Compressed air drills sped up the work, though they also created lung problems from rock dust. Company housing improved marginally, though it remained basic and overcrowded. But the fundamental economic reality never changed. The corporations owned the means of production. The workers sold their labor. The profits flowed upward and outward, leaving Deadwood as an extraction colony rather than a community of prosperous, independent operators. This pattern repeated across the mining West. The story was always the same. Initial placer discovery, frantic rush, quick depletion, corporate consolidation, transformation into wage labor economy. The frontier mythology celebrated the first phase while ignoring the second. For Deadwood specifically, the transition happened faster than in many camps. The placer gold was rich but limited. The hard rock deposits, while extensive, required immediate industrial development. There was no extended middle period where independent miners could adapt and prosper. It was boom, then bust, then corporate control within just a few years. By 1890, when the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier closed, Deadwood had long since ceased to be a frontier town. It was an industrial mining center, no different in economic structure from coal towns in Pennsylvania or copper towns in Montana. The Wild West mythology survived in dime novels and later in Hollywood films, but the reality was far more mundane. The Homestake mine continued operating profitably well into the 20th century. At its peak in the 1930s and 1940s, it employed thousands of workers and produced millions in gold annually. But Deadwood itself remained small, overshadowed by lead, where the Homestake was located. The boom never returned. Today, Deadwood survives primarily through gambling, tourism, and nostalgia. The town has reconstructed its 1870s appearance, false front buildings, period costumes, reenactments of Wild Bill's shooting. Visitors come to experience a sanitized version of the Wild West, complete with slot machines and buildings designed to look like old-time saloons. The real story, the story of placer depletion and corporate consolidation, of dreams deferred and workers exploited, is harder to market. It doesn't fit the mythology. But it's the truth that thousands of men lived through, and it's the pattern that defined the mining West far more than the handful of successful prospectors who made fortunes. Harris Franklin, the miner who stood in Deadwood Gulch in 1877 swirling empty pans, probably never made it into the history books. We don't know what happened to him. Maybe he found work in the corporate mines. Maybe he drifted to another strike. Maybe he gave up and went home. Maybe he's buried in Mount Moriah Cemetery under a marker that long ago weathered away. What we do know is that his experience, arriving full of hope, watching the easy gold vanish, facing the choice between wage labor and destitution, was far more common than striking it rich. That's the story of Deadwood after the gold, not the shootouts and the famous outlaws, not the mythology and the legends, but the economic reality that turned a town of hopeful prospectors into a community of wage laborers working for distant corporations. The transformation took less than 3 years. The consequences lasted for generations, and across the West, in hundreds of mining camps, the same story played out again and again. The promise of independence, the reality of consolidation, the dream of wealth, the truth of wages barely sufficient for survival. Deadwood after the gold, when the money ran out and the real work began.